Hello everyone, welcome back to Loom Keeps. Today we are going to talk about a silent switch from Wuque. This is the Wuque WS silent tactile switch. And what's interesting is they've taken quite a different approach to making a silent switch compared to the other manufacturers. So let's pop it open and I'll show you what I'm talking about. To do a comparison, I'll also pop open one of your normal silent switches as well. If you like silent switches and have tried them out before, this would probably look familiar to you. Alright, so let's start with the typical, right? This is your typical design for a silent switch. You will notice that it basically looks like a normal switch with the exception that there is a silicone insert onto the rail. And what that does is, because silicone is a softer material, it basically cushions the impact when you bottom out, also when your switch rebounds to the top housing, to make sure that you don't make as much of a sound when you are using the switch. And that's typically how silent switches work. It's all around this silicone piece, right? And that's a way that works. It does dampen the switches a lot. The thing is, though, it does introduce a slightly more mushy feel because you're now pressing down against a piece of silicone onto the bottom housing, which some people like because it is kind of softer on your fingertips. It doesn't, for people that have kind of the RSIs like carpal tunnel, for example, this is a more comfortable bottom out. But some people like the more crisp bottom out of non-silicone switches. And so that's what brings us to today's design. And up top, you can see that I've done a deeper analysis on some of the Durox silent switches, which basically use a very similar design. And I go into detail about how the silicone works and why it works and what trade-offs are made in making a silent switch. So please do like and subscribe to our videos. I go in depth into a lot of switch design details and why I think they've done things a certain way. And we go into the technical details. So if you like that kind of stuff, subscribe to our channel, please. We really appreciate it. So without further ado, let's take a look at what Wuque has done instead. Now, before we go into this, though, I want to go quickly into the theory of why switches make the sound that they do, right? Sound is really just caused by vibrations. And when you have two hard materials, which your bottom housing and your stem are typically made of some type of semi-hard plastic, like POM, PC, and so forth. When the two hard materials hit each other, they create a vibration which results in a sound, right? And depending on the density of the material being used, the pitch of the sound changes. Now, for a silent switch, you want to prevent as much of that vibration as possible. And the big way to do that is to dampen it, right? Dampening is, without going to the specifics of the physics behind it, is really around cushioning the impact and spreading out the force over a longer period of time. And that's really how you dampen the vibrations of the switch hitting the bottom housing. And so what the other switches have done is use silicone, which, like I said, is a very effective matter. But what Wuque has done is a little bit different. So let's take a look. So first things first, you will notice that there is no silicone at the bottom of the stem. What they have instead done, though, is create a little bit of a spring in the stem design, right? You can see over here, instead of having a solid filled stem that goes all the way down, there's now a little gap over here. And what that really does is it turns this bottom part of the stem into almost a little bit of a spring, right? There's a bit of give there, right? And what that does is when you bottom out your switch, instead of it ending so abruptly, it will now have a slight spring effect that helps absorb some of the force. By absorbing the force and spreading out that force over a long period of time, you end up with less vibrations and less force hitting the bottom of the switch and creating a more silent typing experience. Now, because of this design and the fact that it's still plastic on plastic instead of silicone, it does mitigate some of that mushiness of the feel. That being said, because of the spring type effect here, it is a different feeling than your standard typing switch as well. So it's a different feeling from the silicone, but also different from your standard switches. So you'd have to try it out to see if you like this feeling better than the silicone. But this gives us another option for how to do silent switches. Now, what this also does though is, because there is a small spring effect over here to create the silencing effect. Now the gap here is actually quite small. So if you type normally and you don't press too hard, that spring is very effective in cushioning the bottom out. But if you're a very, very heavy typer, the spring itself basically bottoms out almost immediately, and the effect is somewhat diminished. So what I'm trying to say is this method works best for typers that are not very hard and heavy typers, and the silencing effect would be effective then. If you're a very heavy typer that strongly bottoms out your switches, this might not achieve the silencing effect that you're looking for, at which point silicone switches are probably better. Otherwise, this switch has a pretty standard design for the more box stem designs, which is quite popular these days. I think it achieves a little bit more stabilization using the box form factor. I'm not going to go into too much detail there. We've talked about box switches before. Today was really all about how Wuque has done their silencing. As I'm putting the switch back, let me talk a little bit about the tech specs of the switch. So the switch itself is made out of a nylon top, nylon bottom, and a palm stem, which is not an atypical material choice. I think nylon switches are quite nice sounding because of their density. Palm stem has a low coefficient of friction. Palm as a material is typically described as quote-unquote self-lubricating. That's not really true. It doesn't really generate lube, but what that basically means is it's got a very low coefficient of friction, which makes it very smooth when sliding against another material, and that's why it's a desirable material when designing your switches. So from a design material choice perspective, I think these are pretty solid material choices, and let's get a sense for how it performs on the board. We now have a couple silent tactile switches to compare. On the left, you have the Wuque WS silent tactile switch. Next up in the brown, you have the Gazzew U4Tx Plum tactile switch. This is a semi-silent switch design. It's not as silent as the rest, but it is very popular. Following which, you have the Outemu silent lemon tactile V2. And lastly, you have the Outemu Cream Yellow switch, silent switch. These are all very popular silent switches. So now, let's put them on the test and see if the theory pans out to that the spring design helps dampen the sound a little bit more than normal when you don't type too heavily. But when you type heavily, in theory, the silicone switches should be more dampened. So let's see if that plans out. So starting with the Wuque Tactile, this is me typing at a roughly normal level of strength. Now comparing to the Gazzew, Outemu silent, Outemu Cream, so right off the bat, I think that Outemu is definitely a more of a silent switch, right? Which is not surprising given that they use a silicone-based design, and so they're heavily dampened. I do think that the Wuque switch is also quieter than your normal switch. Now let's compare the silent switches between the Wuque design and the rest. We also have the new Gazzew Quinn switch here as a basis of comparison for a non-silent switch, just to see the difference. So starting with the Wuque, as a basis of comparison, non-silent tactile. So right off the bat, I wouldn't call the Wuque very silent, but you can definitely hear that it's much dampened on the bottom out compared to the standard switch. It still makes a decent amount of sound, but it is more quiet. Now comparing to the other silent switches, starting with the Gazzew, and now the Outemu Silent Lemon Tactile, and now the Outemu Cream Yellow. So you can see that Outemu is definitely a much more silent compared to the Wuque, which is what we expected because it is silicone based. The feel though, it is definitely mushier compared to your Wuque, which feels closer to a standard switch. It's still not as crisp as the standard non-silent switch, but it is closer. So it's kind of what I would describe it as, it's basically a trade-off between your fully silent switches and your standard switch, right? It trades feeling, right? It feels a little bit better, but it is not as silent, right? The Gazzew is also a hybrid type of switch and is not fully silent, and the feeling is also not as mushy. So these two are more kind of hybrid style switches, I would describe them. Now, onto my hypothesis that the dampening doesn't work as well when you're typing very heavily, right? Just now I was testing at a standard type of force. Now if you're a heavy typer, this is what it sounds like. So there's still a pretty strong dampening effect actually. If you compare the Wuque against the Gazzew, it dampens a lot of that bottom out kind of impact sound and results in kind of more of a thud, right? So it definitely is working, but if you compare it against the silicone, right, as a heavy typer, the silicone definitely works a lot better. But to my surprise, the spring design actually works still really well, even if you're a heavy typer. So the kind of bottoming out of that little spring in the stem isn't as detrimental as I thought it would be. So overall, great design from Wuque. It does give us more options, right? And with custom keyboards, optionality is all it's about, right? So do you like a really silent switch? Go with the silicone-based design, right? That's what these are for. They do have a slightly mushier kind of cushioned bottom out feeling, which some people do like I mentioned, right? If you have fingertip pain, if you have RSIs, go with the silicone-based switches. These are really good and helps cushion out the bottom out to really protect your fingers, and they're really silent to be as well. If you want something that feels a little bit more like a standard switch, go with the more hybrid design, like the Wuque and the Gazzew. Both of these does a good job of retaining some of that standard switch feel while still having a good amount of silencing effect. Lastly, obviously, if you just want a standard switch, there are tons of them out there. That's just a standard switch design. Once again, we are Loom Keeps. Very happy to talk to you about these switch designs. I'm very excited to see innovative designs, and this is another one of them, right? I think we're really entering the golden age of switch designs at this point, where the standard designs, where they do the material swaps, they really kind of almost exhausted what can be done. And so now we're seeing some of these interesting new designs, right? Like the lunar probe that we just talked about a week or two ago, right? And we can link up here if you haven't seen it. Take a look at the Lunar Probe Dual Rail. It's another innovative design from Gazzew, which heavily stabilizes the switch compared to the standard designs, right? So love to talk to you about all these different switch designs. Once again, we are Loom Keeps. Please do like and subscribe and leave us some comments. What do you think? Tell us more. Till next time, take care.